Hello, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to learn about Dostoevsky's Russia, part of the Lit at Apoc series. So here at the Institute, whether we start on time or not during this live broadcast remains to be seen. Must be nice to have a whole staff of people to get you set up on time, but here we are, a few minutes behind schedule, which is the story of my life. But in any case, we have plenty of classes, private literary classes here at Apocatastasis. And in the next month or so, you're going to see a marvelous integration of Substack radio broadcasts and publications unifying our humanities thrust. And a good way to introduce yourself to the literary aspect of Apocatastasis each semester is to check in with our Sappho Center. You can also go to our open events webpage, and we have all sorts of things coming up on, this semester, our authors such as today, Dostoevsky, Brendan Behan, the guy who wrote 100 Years of Solitude, and whatnot. So here's the video, by the way, advertising, what's coming up this semester. So you could check that out. I think on the open events, you have the proper write-up. Why don't we find out? Let's check here. In any case, as I say, these seminars, of which this is kind of an introductory session of remarks, are a great way to support the Institute and also to become involved on a semi-regular basis with our academic life here. There we go. I knew I put a poster together for this semester, and so you can check out all the authors. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, by the way, was the 100 Years of Solitude guy. We looked at Robbie Burns recently. Tennessee Williams is coming up as well. Brendan Behan already mentioned. So very, very good. So here we are all together, and it's so grand to have you join us. These are indeed introductory remarks for a seminar hereafter given over to Dostoevsky's House of the Dead, which sounds like and probably is the name of a zombie movie somewhere out there, the House of the Dead. But we don't have zombies today. But rather, we're going to look at, we don't have zombies at all with Dostoevsky, but we're going to look at, in our time here, the environment from whence Dostoevsky was writing, the type of Russia that was in existence, in tribulation and travail in the 19th century, like many lands in the West. A lot of collisions happening. And so we'll take a look at that. And those collisions, indeed, we can find no better parallel to the reality that the tribulations of a nation are the fruit, in a sense, as is peace, on the other hand, of the state of one's soul. That's actually quite appropriate. So just like political stability or instability is, in fact, a manifestation of the internal life of the people of that land, so is art. So is art. And as historians and as humanists, we have to remember that art, including literature, may be par excellence literature because it can be so mental, so meditative, so cerebral in a way that other art forms are not. That literature is the fruit of an age. All art, even in the broadest sense of anything that comes from the mind or the hands of man, down to the arts as we classify them, all of this is the product of the interior life of men. They are the fruits left over. Dostoevsky has come and gone. Russia of the 19th century has come and gone. Everyone, the millions in Russia and the rest of the world of the 19th century have come and gone. Ourselves, let's not get too high on the hog. Ourselves will not be here in 100 years, no more than we were around 100 years ago. You can think about that. I don't ever really time these sessions, but we are broadcasting this live on the cusp of Holy Lent, on Mardi Gras, or Fat Tuesday, or Carnival. And so we have these ideas of collision. We think of the Peter Bruegel painting, which I always bring up this time of year, the battle between Carnival and Lent, where you have this schema, almost like a Where's Waldo, of all the sinners and saints partying it up at the last and preparing for penance for Lent. So a lot to it, and indeed this bipolarity is nothing new, either to the artist's observation or the saint's observation. You might have joined us last semester as we looked at St. Augustine's City of God. This is indeed not a new observation at all, that man is split inside himself. And may the better angels of our nature win. Okay, so we have a curious type of collage here of Dostoevsky, which we led with. But here's what we want. From Literary Hub, what does it mean to be Russian? On Dostoevsky's early literary ambitions. So Fyodor Dostoevsky is writing in the middle of the 19th century. And indeed, that is a time of great tribulation. You see liberalism picking up great speed. By the mid-19th century, that collision is necessarily going between the old and the new. We can delineate what we mean by that in a moment. But that collision is necessarily going to be more pronounced in the more traditional, so-called backwards, old-fashioned parts of the world. France had that in a titanic way in its revolution in the 18th century. In the 19th and 20th century, it would remain for countries, so-called backwards countries like Russia, China, the 20th century, Turkey, which has lately renamed itself Turkiya. I don't know why people can't just be happy with the names, but hey, whatever. Right, these traditional areas, the Middle East right now is going through convulsive decade of revolutions, and what you see in each instance these past 200 years is very traditional, seemingly static populations being confronted with new ideas, new manners of living in society, new arrangements, new social arrangements. Very often this will revolve around the philosophical and the religious. Dostoevsky's writing, as I say, in the middle of the 19th century, and Russia has long had a hot, cold relationship with the West. We're in, as of this broadcast, a certain cold relationship with the West. And a lot of that has to do, beyond just the coming and going politics of the hour, with really the Enlightenment. How is Russia going to embrace or reject or modify the Enlightenment? And so that Enlightenment and that disparity in various ways of organization between Russia and Western Europe was something even in the 18th century that men in Russia had known. And you have these czars, Catherine the Great, for instance, who would try to introduce different reforms, whether that's to the politics of Russia or to specific parts of the culture. There's certain liturgical things that happen in the 18th century, in fact, that leads to a schism called the Old Orthodox, or the, what do they call themselves? The True Believers. Sometimes they're called the Old Believers. There we go. The Old Believer schism. So anyway, these are growing pains. As I say, France had them and other areas as well. Interestingly, it's worth noting the parts of Europe and North America that did not have such a collision. And those would be places like Germany, the Low Countries, Britain, the British Isles. And it's a huge topic all to itself, but in North America, one of the reasons you don't have a collision between the old and the new in those areas is those are Protestant areas, and we can use different tones of voice and we can interpret it differently. We're not going to do that right now, but Protestantism seemed to have a bit more elbow room for new ideas. Of course, Protestantism, this Northern European type of Christianity, placed a huge emphasis, as it still does, on personal conscience and liberty of conscience and so forth. And so actually, if you look at Orthodox and Catholic countries, we could lump Spain into an area in the 20th century that eventually has its collision with modernity, just as soon as China, Turkey, Russia, and France a little bit earlier. Ireland would have that in the 20th century for very, very different reasons, but ultimately, in its DNA, the same, the collision between the old and the new. The Protestant countries, because of their enshrining of personal liberty, tended not to create this loggerheads between the old and the new. In fact, it was so successful in that the Protestants and the Protestant countries tend to have the opposite problem that Catholic and Orthodox countries have, which is they tend to get subsumed. Their churches tend to get subsumed and gobbled up by the state and by secret societies. And then in the more traditional Orthodox and Catholic countries, and you can see the same phenomena happening in Islam, by the way, right now, in the more traditional, old-fashioned, stuck in their ways Orthodox countries like Russia, you tend to have a much sharper collision, often leading in great bloodshed. So I don't know. You're damned if you do. You're damned if you don't. I guess it's better to be a martyr than to be being co-opted, but neither of which are particularly pleasant. And in either instance, modernity is foreign to Christianity in its roots. So I guess you're going to have a hazard either way. In any case, Dostoevsky, writing in the mid-19th century, is hailing from certainly very, very backwards Russia. You can pad that adjective out, but as the Russians will find in the 20th century, in the First World War, just on a nuts and bolts organizational fashion. I mean, Russia really is almost a medieval country. Its appraisal of the Tsar and the royal family is semi-divine. The connection to the land is almost magical in the true sense of that word, which isn't, it's not quite as Disney-fied as we might imagine. There's a lot of annoying superstitions that peasants have, and this sort of thing. In fact, there's a film I came across lately from Hungary. I'll have to dig it up. I need to upload it. About this orphan that was raised by peasants in the 1930s, and it was horrible, absolutely horrible. Peasants putting coals in their hands and whatever. Okay, so enough of my jabbering. Let's get on with it here. So from Literary Hub, what does it mean to be Russian? On Dostoevsky's early literary ambitions. Dostoevsky was a 23-year-old unemployed and aimless man in a city dominated by the military, the bureaucracy, and rank. Becoming a writer meant resisting the city's rational order. This was particularly difficult to do because another key to Tsar Nicholas's control of Russia was his control over literature and the circulation of ideas. Nicholas's regime considered virtually all secular literature hostile to an orderly society. Nicholas expanded the dragnet for dangerous words almost immediately after his coronation. Organized Christianity, and this would certainly include the Orthodox Church, was still strong enough in the 19th century to attempt things like censorship and to try to work with the state. Because, as I say, the fundamental ideas of the Enlightenment, they might be able to be Christianized, but they are not in their origin at all copacetic to Christianity. And the churchmen knew that. And the churchmen knew that. And to a certain extent, the liberals knew that. And that's why, in each instance, they were willing to come to blows over who will dominate. Will secular liberalism dominate, or will, shall we say, medieval worldview continue? Obviously, the liberals won. More than a dozen censorship offices in different ministries inspected virtually all printed material, and the list of banned books was updated monthly. The Black Office reviewed foreign periodicals arriving by mail. International tourists had to forfeit their books and wait, sometimes for days, for the Foreign Censorship Committee to clear them. Censors worried about secret codes hidden in musical scores and phrases like forces of nature and intellectual ferment, or unacceptably inflammatory. Nicholas shut down a newspaper for publishing an unfavorable review of a play he quite liked. Rather frivolous. He outlawed German philosophy altogether. Don't forget for a second that Napoleon and the invasion of the French has a lot to do with the cooling of the Enlightenment, as far as the Russians were concerned, or the cooling towards the West. Very often there are these concrete historical circumstances which explain maybe these philosophical growing pains. Domestic journalism was hamstrung. Every new periodical required state approval, which could take years. Censors pored over each issue before it could be printed, which made timely issues difficult and newspapers almost impossible. Editors were sometimes incarcerated for violations, as were overly permissive censors. Warier censors anticipated how an irate superior or selfish high-ranking noble might react to any particular article or phrase. Enterprising censors rewrote questionable passages themselves. Russian literature had been largely a state and church-sponsored enterprise for decades. Something we often forget is a lot of art prior to, let's say, the 19th century here is, well, I guess it's the same as now, isn't it? The ruling power is going to use art for its ends, as propaganda. Maybe your patron is Augustus Caesar, and you write the Aeneid because he's paying you, or maybe it's the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, or maybe it's the CIA right now. Whoever's in power has a great interest in influencing the art. Because again, if you can influence the ideas going into someone's mind, you influence their internal life, that will rebound into how, once again, the external looks and operates, and how society looks and operates. It's almost chicken and the egg sort of thing, isn't it? The government funded or supported dozens of journals that operated as state organs. Nothing new there. Officials co-opted identical, influential writers and editors by paying them. Newspapers couldn't be sold on the street or in railway stations, and commercial advertisements were banned, which kept prices high. Publications struggled to reach more than a few thousand subscribers, with scattershot news items, meandering letters from Russians abroad, and reports on occasional crimes, usually foreign. And indeed, we'll make our way over to a brief outline of House of the Dead by Dostoevsky soon enough. We see the role of crime and crime journalism in a lot of Dostoevsky's works. In fact, in Brothers Karamazov, which is our author's last published text, and one that has a certain crossover with House of the Dead, you recall there's a character there who, in fact, is reading about murders in the international press, and that precedes I forget the name of the brother, but the one who's accused of murdering his father, right? So it's kind of anticipation, foreshadowing, we call it, of the topic of murder earlier, or one of the brothers, I think the one who ends up being accused, is reading in the foreign press what we call now true crime. And if the people in Russia in the 19th century were anything like John Coleman, true crime is quite addictive, I must say. There was not a single reference to the Petersburg flood in 1824 in any Russian newspaper. Hundreds of thousands of people lived through a disaster that consumed the capital. And it was as if it had never happened. Under Nicholas's reign, the silences rippled outward, while the annual number of books published in Russia had tripled. In the first third of the 19th century, by 1837, the growth had ceased. It remained stagnant for the next 15 years. And you see me checking here the tech, because you do not want to be broadcasting and having things not doing so. So you can see some of these well-known books by Dostoevsky. How many of them have to do with crime, right? The Brothers Karamazov, The Possessed, The Idiot, Crime and Punishment. It's pretty obvious. Dostoevsky's decision to renounce his estate and become a writer was, by any reasonable estimate, absurd. It was nearly unheard of to make a living from literary fiction. Pulpit adventure tales and illustrated chapbooks were profitable. Literature wasn't. Almost all Russian writers of note were either landed gentry, deriving income from estates with hundreds of serfs, or else they were high-ranking state or military officials. Lermontov, Pushkin, Turgenev, Goncharov, Tolstoy, none of them renounced anything in order to write fiction because no one turned to writing to pay their bills. Russian literature developed as a social grace for elites, and their disdain for professional writing helped them retain control. Genuine literature, they insisted, was unsullied by commerce. Money destroys an author's principles, keen thinking, and good taste. Dostoevsky's plan was not just an impudent risk. For an upwardly striving family, it was crass. Very aristocratic attitude altogether. Keep in mind, speaking of ideas circulated in the press, you have two major things, and this will challenge any sort of Christianity you please, one of which is evolution, and particularly Charles Darwin's Origin of Species book, published, I believe, in 1859. And then the other is a broader concept of higher criticism coming out of Germany, reading the Bible as a natural historical document. It's not our place here to critique the merits of those things, evolution or higher criticism. But what's interesting to the humanist, the historian, to the literary critic, is the consternation this caused people of faith. And this would continue, I would say, really through the First World War. And then after that, certainly after the Second War, you see people of faith coming to a certain rapprochement with modern ideas, but not in the 19th century. And if Dostoevsky eventually, beyond the footprint of life that this article focuses on, eventually will be writing from a position of faith and cultural conservatism. If you want to, the opposite of that, take a look at someone like Victor Hugo, who appreciates the same sort of collision between the old and the new in his French writing. The insert here says Petersburg was becoming the center of Russian literature in the 1840s, and the city's readers were shaping its content. Even without its social taboos and government hostility, Russia would have been a difficult place for a writer. The mid-19th century literacy rate was low, 15%, might be generous, whilst France, Germany, Britain, the United States, Protestant countries all, had majority literature populations. Why? Well, because you have to read the Bible to talk to God, right? And that's why Protestant countries had such an emphasis on education. Russia's small readership forced publishers to rely on high prices. A copy of Gogol's Dead Souls cost 10 rubles. Many novels, 25 to 30, nearly half of the average bureaucrat's monthly salary. What would that be? That'd be like buying a PlayStation. I don't know what these things go for. I heard Nintendo's going to sell a machine for $500. Right. So imagine if books cost $500, right? High prices kept the book market small. There was only about 1,000 titles published in Russia every year. Nearly half of them were foreign. The best solution to the adverse market was to aggregate as many readers as possible in subscription lists. Do you think Substack's new? You think Substack's new for having authors being funded by subscription. That was very 19th century, and not just for literature, but for a lot of anything social, church buildings, labor unions, labor causes, everything was subscriptions, nothing new. You think how do you say, buy me a coffee and whatever these apps are, you think those are new? Well, the apps are. Substack is new, but the method is as old as you please. Purchasing a book was a commitment. We have the opposite problem now, right? We're too familiar with books in the sense that they're everywhere. We don't care about them. But subscribing to a journal was a stroll through the arcade. Novels appeared in installments in the 19th century. If you didn't like one narrative's development, there was another one in the same issue. If you didn't like novels at all, you could read summaries of world events, or about Constantinople in the 4th century, or about recent discoveries in physiology, or a popular essay on how the new planet Neptune was discovered. Some contributions are specialized. So some examples, but literature was bundled with everything, right? A lot of these big ass books that we read, like the Brothers Karamazov, were published serially over a long time. A lot of Dickens stuff was too, right? They become known as thick journals. Each issue was hundreds of pages. The Library for Reading, one of the first thick journals, boasted 57 contributors. Its content was greatly light and apolitical. But it published translations of Victor Hugo and Balzac, Dickens, James, Fenimore Cooper. 7,000 subscribers paid 50 rubles per year, the price of a few books, to be cultured and informed. More than 200 journals come and went during Nicholas's reign. The turnover was a sign of precarity, just like websites now, YouTube channels, whatever. But it was also a sign that people found risks worth taking. By the 1840s, there was a small ecosystem of durable journals. And they paid their writers well. Imagine that. Book publishing, still lagging behind Europe, but Russia's biggest journals had circulations about as high as their British and French counterparts, and the reach was wider than the subscription list. For ambitious young writers like Dostoevsky, however, the thick journals dominated, and their domination seemed like a trap. Russia's embryonic market allowed a handful of opportunistic publishers to band together and squeeze out competitors. It was a club sustained by bribes, threats, favors, blacklists, and mutual promotion. It's an oligarchy, Dostoevsky complained to his brother in 1845. Submitting your work to a journal meant yoking yourself to editors and their sycophants, to the main maitre d', he complained, to all the sluts and kitchen boys who nestle in the nests from which enlightenment is disseminated. Everyone thought the business of journals was crass. Again, it's so interesting. Only now, with the internet being around for 30 years popularly, only now are serious academics turning towards sites like Substack, or you had to dribble maybe in the past 15 or 20 years that would try to build up an online presence. But isn't this human nature, right? A lot of authors, a lot of thinkers now, they clung to the old institutions until they were either turned out on their ear or just could not financially make it work. The same obviously is happening with the college teachers. And that will continue. Well, guess what? It was the same here, and the same conservatism where you want to stick with the nobles and men of property writing your books, and they can maintain this patrician sneer towards the commercial authors. But the commercial authors are plucky. They have to write, and they have to woo their audience. Yes, that has artistically all sorts of dangers, but it also keeps you hungry. It also keeps you innovating. Last paragraph from here, and then we'll swing over to a look at the House of the Dead. Nikolaevin, Russia, was an unlikely place for world literature to develop, but beneath the surface, there was just enough wealth and education, just enough curiosity and self-scrutiny, just enough daring and insecurity and pride to create a new literary capital on the old continent. Petersburg was becoming the center of Russian literature in the 1840s, and the city's readers were shaping its content. Roughly half of Russia's readers were civil servants, military officials engaged in meaningless work for a state they earnestly wanted to value. It was as if there was a surplus of meaning floating downstream looking for somewhere to land. That experience needed articulation. Tu autem domine miserere nobis, de gracias. Thus is the incipit of this article. It's a lot longer than I thought it was, by Kevin Birmingham. What does it mean to be Russian on Dostoevsky's early literary ambitions? Not only was the article longer than I imagined, I'll link this down below for you after the broadcast, but also the part we read was actually impressively long. Don't mind if I do. All right, so that's something of the background, the old and the new. Now, Dostoevsky goes through a transformation, and that is, as a young man, as he's milling about, photoshopped or not, milling about Russia, he starts as a liberal, as a socialist, and he ends as a much more, this is hardly towards the end of his life, he's still a very young man here. Don't let the hairline fool you. Don't let the hairline fool you. Not that I would know anything at all about receding hairlines. But indeed, at later points in his life, maybe when this image is depicting, always going to be the last image I click on, of course. Where is it? There we go. Even here, this is still not old. But anyway, Dostoevsky will end his life. Yes, I mean, having still clung to liberal positions, but ones that have great echo by the end of his life. Ones that he realized have great echoes. I say they're not quite the same. Liberal egalitarianism is not Christian brotherhood, but there are echoes there for sure. And the event that causes this for Dostoevsky, which comes up again and again in his novels, as we'll see with The House of the Dead, is the fact that he was arrested for socialist publications and sent to a gulag, a work camp up near the North Pole. Those two are not 20th century inventions by Stalin. The gulag long precedes the communists in Russia. And so Dostoevsky is sentenced to death for his wicked liberal activities by the irredentist, you want an old-fashioned word, the irredentist Tsar and his bureaucracy. And as they're being led out, this is the event that really shifts Dostoevsky for the rest of his life. As him and the other socialists are being led out to be executed in this prison, the guards load their guns, everyone's getting blindfolded. It's time to meet your maker, and all of a sudden the Tsar pardons them and commutes their death sentence to 5 or 6 years of hard labor, followed by some period of parole. And this event completely shakes Dostoevsky, not necessarily the mercy of it, but just the mind F, as we say in American slang, the mind warp, that literally facing your death in a couple minutes and then not will do to you. And that begins indeed a period of soul searching for Dostoevsky, where he will come to a much more traditional view of life, while still, as I say, maintaining a lot of the idealism that liberalism kept for him as a young man, but seeing that often in Christianity. Okay. And those prison memories indeed express themselves in the Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, and then also to the seminar, the private seminar later this afternoon, to The House of the Dead. This is translated Memoirs from the House of the Dead. There are some other ways that people translate the Russian. This is interesting because, we just read on the other article the idea that nobles and military men that are sitting around all day, they have a surplus of meaning they have to do, right? Their work is meaningless at an individual level and maybe even an institutional level. They're kind of just fiddling their thumbs, literally just killing time. There's the human desire to find meaning in things. And so you put that energy elsewhere into literature in this instance. Well, I can't think of that dynamic any more powerful than in a prison, right? If you think a bureaucrat in the town hall is wondering, what the hell am I doing? What is this for? And this is all pointless. You better believe prisoners have similar conclusions. And that's why, arguably, prison literature is so poignant. And we would put Memoirs from the House of the Dead in the same boat as The Ballad of Reading Gaol, which I'll be presenting on towards Holy Week time, by Oscar Wilde and his tribulation in prison. I also think of Brendan Behan's Borstal Boy. These are monuments of literature, but they're also, along with Dostoevsky here, they're also monuments of prison literature. In this almost documentary account of his own experiences in penal servitude in Siberia, Dostoevsky describes the physical and mental suffering of the convicts, the squalor and degradation in relentless detail, the intricate procedure whereby the men strip for the bath, the sauna, we would say, which is not necessarily a luxury thing as we might associate, without removing their 10-pound long fetters, is an extraordinary tour de force. Compared by Turgenev to passages from Dante's Inferno, terror and resignation, the rampages of a psychopath. Terror and resignation, let's say that again, the rampages of a psychopath, the brief, serene interlude of Christmas Day. Terror and resignation are evoked by Dostoevsky, writing several years after his release, with a strikingly uncharacteristic detachment. I don't really know what to say about this book. The House of the Dead, this reviewer says, was bleak and dark, full of descriptions of murder and philosophical thoughts about prison and appropriate punishment, but it was also morbidly fascinating. I found myself gripped by Dostoevsky's detailed descriptions of prison life and the various characters he brought to life in this story. It's clearly a memoir of Dostoevsky's own time in exile in Siberia, but it's framed as a loose collection of facts. It isn't necessarily episodic, and I feel like each section did fit together in a coherent fashion, but there isn't a traditional plot in this novel. It's not really a novel, to be honest. Instead, it focuses on the stories of each prisoner and the events and discussions that the narrator, Alexander Petrovich Goryanichov, experiences during his time in prison. Everything is connected together through common themes, and the reviewer really liked the format that Dostoevsky used. So here we have, let's try to just recapitulate things. Here we have Dostoevsky in a Russia that is confronted with liberalism, with growing pains, and that is insistent officially to accepting any of this, and is resisting it very much. And then we have himself, outside of the larger situation, suffering in prison for these very ideas. And also, as I think any of us who've been around any sort of system, political, religious, cultural, educational, whatever, for any length of time, no matter how sympathetic you are, eventually you will start noticing holes. And Dostoevsky does. He does see limitations to liberalism. He sees especially the limitations of its materialistic aspect. Materialistic in the sense, not that it buys shit on Amazon all the time, use that word or misuse that word, but rather that the happiness and the contentment that the socialist envisions is largely superficial, and like a lot of types of liberalism, conservative or liberal, forgive me, capital L, lowercase l. In any case, it's very, the Enlightenment is very materialistic in the sense that it views reality as combinations of molecules, more or less. And so Dostoevsky's hungering, yes, okay. The idealism of youth drove Dostoevsky to liberalism and socialism, but the youth also hungers for beauty, and socialism might be able to assuage and indeed to scratch that itch of idealism and sacrifice for a young person. But to find true beauty, and this, of course, comes up again and again. I think it's the Brothers Karamazov, where the famous line of Dostoevsky's is given, that beauty will save the world. It's largely religious faith, a philosophical faith, a moral journey, something beyond the politics of the Enlightenment, something deeper than socialism, which will answer that sort of beauty. Or to rephrase this whole line of thought, socialism might be able to address happiness. It cannot address beauty. Any natural system can. And so Dostoevsky, during his prison years, comes to appreciate his Russian Orthodox faith and the faith of Russia. One thing I noticed was how old-fashioned this particular translation seemed. Some of the words chosen by the translator just struck me as odd, and when I looked in the copyright section at the front of the book, I realized this translation was from 1956, which makes a lot of sense. It might have been an accurate translation, but certain words just seemed out of place with the rest of the text. Okay, and then there are various other people opining on this piece here, The House of the Dead. In addition to some of these prison memoirs that I mentioned, again, beyond The House of the Dead, The Ballad of Reading Jail, and Borstal Boy, I'm also struck in the 20th century with very similar character studies, basically. And that would be Down and Out in Paris and London, The Road to Wogan Pier, both of which by George Orwell in the 1930s, where he's a traveling worker, kind of bumming around, dishwashing as I did for many years. And then really before I had read Memoirs from the House of the Dead, I would have actually said this was the beginning of this sort of tradition. But I think the tradition of, that is to say, speaking of low status social things in the first person that you experience, whether that's low paying work, low status work like dishwashing in Paris or London, or prison, which is also very low status, designed to be low status. Narrating this genre of 20th century literature, up until I had read this piece from Dostoevsky, I would have said that the start of all this was the journey into night. Not the Long Day's journey into night, but the post-World War I French book, The Journey into Night. Let's see if we can get the name. I think the guy's first name was Emile, not Emile Zola. Not Eugene O'Neill. That's not what we're talking about. Hold on, let's just try here. But yeah, I mean, this book describes a guy, is bumming around France during the First World War. It's written in the after or the post-war period. A Journey to the End of Night, 1932. Is a landmark French novel by Louis Ferdinand Céline. Céline became very right-wing and supporter of the National Socialists in the 30s, and so all the liberals in the colleges ignore him and pretend he doesn't exist, but he's very well worth reading. And if those are not your politics, as they are not mine, don't worry. The Long Journey into Night, to the End of Night, whatever, by Céline, is well worth reading. I had thought before reading Dostoevsky's House of the Dead, anyhow, that this sort of book where you're kind of narrating things in the first person and giving this conga line, really, of these individual vignettes of characters, really quirky people that you're encountering. I thought that was from Celine's book, but I need to revise that now. I think this format is something that Dostoevsky very much develops, and that was picked up by Céline and taken in its own direction, which would go on to influence Orwell and would go on to influence Bien and others as well, and a lot of the beat, kind of the Jack Kerouac sorts and stuff later on. So with that being seen, Chu, thank you for joining me here for Dostoevsky's Russia, taking a look in the big picture at some of the growing pains his country was experiencing in the mid-19th century. and would continue to experience in the 20th, because there would be that collision ultimately in the Russian Revolution between the old and the new. And then also looking in particular at an intimate way, introducing the House of the Dead. The House of the Dead, in this period of Dostoevsky's life, as influential in his trajectory and his change, maybe the sharpening of his idealism from the secular to the faithful, perhaps. From the progressive to the conservative, perhaps. And then also analyzing and placing this book within the tradition of kind of first-person narrative, low-status memoirs, which we see continuing well through the 20th century. So not too shabby. All right, so I'm going to get prepared for the proper seminar that comes hereafter. There's a lot of ways you can become part of the life of the school, and I always recommend the best way to start, but not to stop, is to check out our Sappho Center, check out our open events, and there's the write-up for the literary series. I think on the Sappho Center I just have the video, but on the open event site there's the video and the write-up. As I began this broadcast, so I end it. It'd be grand to have a whole staff of people to take care of this. That's not the case, although I do have a very good staff that I work with here at the Institute. The day-to-day stuff does fall on me, and things therefore fall through the cracks. But they always get done, and we always make some time to enjoy literature. So thank you so much. Hope you learned a bit about Dostoevsky's Russia, and I will see you soon. Valete.